Welcome everyone to today's webinar on the call for proposals for People, Parks, and Power, a national initiative for green space, health equity, and racial justice. Throughout today, we will be referring to the initiative as People, Parks, and Power, or sometimes P3 for short. P3 is a joint effort of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, led and managed by Prevention Institute. My name is Rachel Bennett, and I'm a program manager at Prevention Institute, providing management to the P3 initiative. I'm so pleased to introduce you to my colleagues, Manal J. Abalata, Deputy Executive Director of Prevention Institute, and Elva Yanez, Prevention Institute's Director of Health Equity. And also to our wonderful funding partners, Dr. Pamela Russo, Senior Program Officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Rebecca Morley, Consultant to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Sean Thackerdine, Program Associate for the Environment at Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Pamela, Rebecca, and Sean, and for your leadership and support of the P3 initiative. Before we get started today, I want to mention that we will be taking questions throughout the webinar, and following the presentation portion, we will have plenty of time for Q&A. After today's webinar, you are also welcome to submit questions via email to p3info@rwjf.org. There is a program-specific frequently asked questions document, or FAQ document, that you'll find in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's online application system. And we will be updating that next week to include questions received during today's webinar and questions we receive over the next few days. After next week, when we update that program-specific FAQ document, we will still be accepting your questions via email, again at p3info@rwjf.org, but we won't be updating that program-specific FAQ document again after next week. So with that, I will ask Pamela and Sean to please take a moment to welcome our participants on behalf of the foundations, and then we will get into describing the P3 call for proposals and the application process. Pamela?
Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the turnout today and the interest in the P3 initiative has affirmed our commitment to the principles underlying the initiative. Today's launch builds on a thoughtful planning process led by our creative thought partner, the Prevention Institute. The team at Prevention Institute engaged with diverse stakeholders across the country to inform the approach and to design this groundbreaking initiative. P3 represents a new approach to rectifying park and green space inequities that is based on addressing the root causes of those inequities and implementing a strong policy and systems change approach that will lead to long-term change for the better across the city. The initiative is focused on community-based building organizations that can speak to community priorities. The initiative will support these community organizations in increasing their capacity to advocate for policy change, including policies and practices to share decision-making, prevent displacement, and create jobs for community residents. The foundation has shifted much of its grant making over the last 3 years to supporting on-the-ground, frontline community organizations in building power in low-income communities and communities of color. The foundation is also committed to addressing the underlying causes of marginalization and disinvestment in communities that resulted in an inequitable distribution of parks and green spaces, such as structural racism. We were extremely fortunate to be able to expand the number of communities that can participate through a partnership with the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. I will now pass the mic to Sean Thackerdine.
Thanks, Pamela, and welcome everyone as well on behalf of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. It's an exciting moment of lift for the People, Parks, and Power Initiative, and the foundation is thrilled to be a partner in this endeavor. This is the first time our two foundations have worked together as one of the largest conservation funders, working together with the largest health funder in the United States. The partnership is itself a breakthrough, one that builds on the emerging recognition that parks and green space inequities are at once health and environmental challenges. It is also a partnership that lifts up what is an intersectional approach to addressing these inequities. Communities most impacted, most proximate to the issues must be in the lead to design and advance policy solutions that address the legacy of these inequities. As a conservation funder, we recognize the myriad forces which have created the landscape where we live, work, and play. And through this work, we recognize the role that community-led design and equity-centered policy play in recreating our cities and the green space within them. We are fortunate to be a part of this partnership to support the burgeoning movement of which all of you are a part, and to learn from our esteemed colleagues at the Prevention Institute. Manal, over to you.
So as Rachel mentioned earlier, my name is Manal Abalata, and I am Deputy Executive Director at Prevention Institute. Prevention Institute is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting health, equity, safety, and well-being. We focus on preventing illness and injury before they occur by addressing the policies, the systems, and community-level factors that influence health behaviors and outcomes. Our work on park and green space equity goes back 15 years, including through statewide policy advocacy and training, as well as with recent policy and systems change work here in Los Angeles County, where I am joining you from. For all of us, this new national initiative represents a momentous turning point in the field, and we are truly honored to be directing and managing People, Parks, and Power in collaboration with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. The goal of today's webinar are to introduce this new national funding initiative, provide details on the call for proposals, which was initially released on September 15th, 2021, and to answer questions about the funding opportunity. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, Elva, who will talk about the goals and core focus of the P3 initiative. Thank you, Elva.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here with us today. And apologies for the technical difficulties on the translation. Let me just say we're getting a ton of questions in the Q&A box, and we are doing our best to answer them live. If we do not get to your question immediately, we will have a FAQ document on our websites, and hopefully all questions will be answered. So just a little sidebar there. Thanks, Manal, for the introduction. The goal of People, Parks, and Power is to accelerate a new movement for parks and green space equities, led by the communities that for generations have suffered the negative health, social, and environmental consequences of park, green space, and other built environment inequities. This initiative comes at a critical time in our nation's history. The pandemic and the nation's reckoning with racial injustice have led to greater appreciation of parks and green spaces as essential community infrastructure, as well as growing awareness of how structural racism shapes inequitable community environments and related health outcomes. Recognizing that people in power drive policy and systems change, P3 prioritizes investing in the capacity of communities closest to the problem and the organizations that represent their interests as key to building an effective movement for park and green space equity in the US. P3's theory of change, which you see here, centers proven power building strategies honed by generations of racial justice, social justice, and environmental justice advocates working for transformative community change. We want to underscore P3's focus on community power and power building. As our friend and colleague, Dr. Manuel Pastor, director of University of Southern California's Equity Research Institute recently said, quote, Philanthropy has long thought about the social determinants of health, but not always what determines social determinants, and that's power and policy, unquote. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation are committed to investing in power and policy with the P3 initiative. With the resources and reputation of these two philanthropic institutions behind it, the initiative has the potential to transform how we address park and green space inequities in the highest need communities in the US. This collaborative investment, joining the nation's largest health funder with one of the nation's most prominent climate and environmental funders, communicates the message that advancing park equity is a health equity issue, a racial justice issue, and a climate justice issue, and a national imperative that merits our collective action. So with that, I'll turn it back to Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks, Elva. As the call for proposals says, P3 will support community-based organizations and base building groups working in urban, low-income communities of color across the United States to advance park and green space equity through local policy and systems change. The geographic focus of the P3 initiative is urban areas in the United States, with a particular interest in small and mid-sized cities. So that's cities with fewer than 500,000 residents. But we're also open to funding distinct communities within larger cities that have suffered the consequences of historic disinvestment and that have deficits in park space, park conditions, programming, and a lack of green infrastructure as compared to neighboring, more affluent communities. P3 will fund community-based organizations that build power among community residents and that are working to change policies at the local level. So that's the citywide level, county-wide level, or district-wide level. Through this call for proposals, a total of $7 million is available, and we expect to award grants of up to $500,000 each, or $250,000 a year. Grants will be 24 months in duration, 2 years long, and we expect to award up to 14 grants. I do want to take a moment just to mention lobbying restrictions here. P3 grant funds may not be used for lobbying. Under federal law, funds provided by a private foundation are not ever eligible to be used for lobbying purposes. Although, generally speaking, activities that constitute advocacy or base building or community organizing, public education, or educating decision makers can be conducted in ways that do not constitute lobbying. So we would encourage you to check out RWJF's lobbying guidelines, which are available on the Foundation's website, to learn more about which activities do or don't constitute lobbying. And in the P3 call for proposals, you can find a full list of the activities that are allowable and not allowable to do with P3 funds. Now, Manal will elaborate on the key pillars of the P3 initiative before we then go through the eligibility criteria, selection criteria, the application timeline, and how to apply. Manal?
So building on Elva's opening remarks earlier, the North Star of the P3 initiative is policy and systems change. P3 will not fund planning, building, or operating on the ground projects. While we absolutely recognize the need for new parks, green infrastructure, and improvements to existing facilities in high-need communities, the purpose of this initiative is to create resources for critical and often underfunded policy advocacy and systems change work. From our perspective, the downside of relying exclusively on project development to reverse inequities is that project work alone leaves root causes firmly in place and does not strike at the heart of the policies, practices, and norms that have created these inequities in the first place. This, in the next slide, Vanessa, this sentiment was reflected by one of our subject matter experts in the planning phase, who simply said, "We can't build our way out." Next slide. For these reasons, the P3 initiative takes a policy and systems change approach to achieving park equity. Prevention Institute's recent publication, Changing the Landscape, describes this orientation and our rationale for it. We strongly advise prospective applicants to read the paper, which is a product of our research and practice over many years, and whose ideas were refined and expanded during the planning phase that led to this initiative. Thank you. A second pillar of the P3 initiative is community power building. For generations, African Americans, Latinos, and people living in low-income urban areas across the United States have disproportionately been denied the health, social, and environmental benefits of parks and green spaces. Unlike some park and green space funding opportunities, P3 is designed to resource communities so that they can flex their power to redress inequitable policies and unfair systems that produce park and green space inequities in the first place. P3 uses the definition of community power from RWJF's Lead Local Initiative. They say community power is the ability of communities most impacted by structural inequity to develop, sustain, and grow an organized base of people who act together through democratic structures to set agendas, shift public discourses, influence who makes decisions, and cultivate ongoing relationships of mutual accountability with decision makers that change systems and advance health equity. At its core, P3 is a policy and systems change initiative that will fund grantees to bring to bear their power building and policy advocacy expertise in the arena of parks and green space. In the next slide, you'll see that the third pillar of P3 is a focus on urban areas. The P3 initiative is responsive to extensive research, which demonstrates that urban neighborhoods with predominantly African American and Latino residents have suffered the brunt of park inequities in the United States. Many studies across multiple geographic areas have shown that African Americans, Latinos, and people who live in low-income urban neighborhoods have less access to green spaces than people who live in more affluent or predominantly white communities. And this is referencing just one source from our colleague and partner in the planning initiative, Alessandro Rigolon from the University of Utah. In the next slide, you'll see that a 2020 study from the Trust for Public Land also found that parks serving communities of color are on average half the size of parks located in majority white communities and 5 times as crowded. Therefore, once again, the geographic focus of the P3 initiative is urban areas, with a particular interest in supporting work in small and mid-sized cities, which we define as those under 500,000 population. And we are also interested in distinct and disinvested communities within larger cities. Hopefully that responds to a number of questions that came up in the Q&A earlier. There is no minimum threshold for population size to be eligible for this funding opportunity. However, we do want to emphasize that the focus of P3 is on urban areas and not rural communities. We do hope that with the success of the P3 initiative, parallel efforts will arise to address the unique conditions and park inequities experienced in rural communities. And finally, a fourth pillar of P3 is supporting community-driven policy action. As Rachel said earlier, P3 will fund community-based organizations that build power and are working to advance equity-focused policy and system change at the citywide, countywide, or district-wide level. We recognize the importance of state and federal policy action, and we generally see that as complementary to P3, but it is not the focus of the initiative, which, as we said, is community-driven policy advocacy at the local level. Community-based organizations that are led by people of color and build community power to influence public policy at the local level are strongly encouraged to apply. This includes both groups that are already working on local equity-focused park policy, as well as groups that may be new to this issue, but do have a history of advancing equity-focused policy on related issues such as built environment, civil rights, climate change, community development, environmental justice, racial justice, water equity, and so forth. We are also interested in funding a spectrum of eligible organizations across the United States, including those that may be early in their park equity policy advocacy work, as well as those who are more experienced and already may have campaigns underway.
As Manal said a few moments ago, our recent publication, Changing the Landscape, People, Parks, and Power, talks about a policy and systems change approach to advancing park and green space equity. In that paper, we also provide some examples of local level policies and systems change efforts that have been implemented in jurisdictions across the US. So we want to share these examples here today to answer a question you may be wondering, which is what types of local policies or system changes will P3 grants support? I do want to.
I need to interrupt you again. A number of Q&A. I want to make sure people hear you. And it looks like people have given guidance. Please select English and unmute original, and please see if that works. And Stephanie, I'm going to adopt you as the person to respond. If you unmute original and press English, could you type into the Q&A that if you can hear now? Rachel, go again. I'm sorry, so sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. Thank you. We do want to make sure that everyone can hear. Stephanie will ask whether you are able to hear now. Thanks.
Okay, I think it's working for enough people now. Thank you, Stephanie. I see you. Go ahead, Rachel.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks, everyone. So I'll just repeat what I just said to make sure everyone could hear, which is that you might be wondering what types of policies or system change efforts P3 will support. So we want to say, the right policy or systems change goal is really going to depend on your own local context. And that is influenced by a whole host of factors, historical and cultural factors, financial and ecological and political factors, and also by the specific park and green space inequities that communities in your city experience, and the specific solutions that you and your community residents are identifying. In the publication, Changing the Landscape, People, Parks, and Power that Manal talked about a moment ago, we do include some examples of local level policies and systems change efforts that have been implemented in jurisdictions across the US. So we wanted to share these quickly just as some examples of the kinds of things that folks have been working on, but not to limit you with these examples. We do encourage P3 applicants to think of innovative policy ideas that could address park and green space inequities in your local context. So some examples of what jurisdictions have been doing and what community-based organizations have been advocating for are things like public finance measures that specifically earmark funds to address park and green space inequities in high-need communities, or public agency policies that prioritize equity in their internal processes, things like equitable budget allocations or staff diversity and so on. or policy directives that do comprehensive jurisdiction-wide assessments to quantify and in some cases map park and green space needs and inequities that currently exist. Or things like joint use policies to open up schoolyards to serve as park space, or other land use policies to increase access to parks and green space. Or things like establishing community engagement units within public agencies, or even anti-displacement policies or provisions that are related to new parks and green spaces. So again, we encourage you to consider these examples, not to feel limited by them, but just to help answer that question of what are the kinds of efforts that will be supported under this funding opportunity, and check out the Changing the Landscape publication to learn more. So next, we will spend a few minutes talking through the eligibility criteria for P3 applicants. As the call for proposals says, applicant organizations must be nonprofit organizations or public entities that are tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. We've received a number of questions actually so far about that term public entities and whether that includes public agencies, so government agencies, or even public universities. And I want to clarify, it does not. The term public entities has a specific meaning in the Internal Revenue Code, but to clarify, P3 grants will only be awarded to 501c3 nonprofit organizations. And we sincerely apologize for any confusion that that term public entities may have caused. P3 awards will only be made to organizations, not to individuals. But organizations that are fiscally sponsored by a 501c3 entity and that meet all the other eligibility criteria are eligible to apply. Coalitions are also eligible as long as the lead applicant meets all the other eligibility criteria. And in the case of a coalition that's applying, one organization needs to be the lead applicant, and they will be the organization that is responsible for the administrative oversight of the grant. I do want to mention that coalitions that include government partners or that include university partners or other academic institutes are eligible to apply. But again, the lead applicant needs to be a nonprofit organization. If the lead applicant is a government agency or a university or another academic institution, that will not be considered an eligible application. It needs to be led by a nonprofit organization. Lead applicants will need to demonstrate the capacity to manage a grant award of this size, either directly or with the benefit of technical assistance. And finally, applicant organizations must be based in the United States or its territories. There are two phases in the competitive proposal process for P3. First, letters of intent, and then invited full proposals. So the selection process will involve the following steps. First, all applicants will submit a letter of intent, or LOI, which will be reviewed by a team of reviewers. Then selected applicants will be invited to submit a full proposal. So in other words, not all LOI applicants will be invited to submit a full proposal. Those invited applicants will then write and submit full proposals, and those will be reviewed by a team of reviewers. And finally, grant awards will be made to up to 14 applicants. So review of the P3 applications will be based on the following criteria. And I should say, we've shortened the descriptions of the selection criteria here on the slides just for ease of readability. So I strongly encourage you to closely review the call for proposals to make sure you understand what's expected. First, LOI reviewers and full proposal reviewers will be looking at whether an applicant has demonstrated capacity to work effectively on equitable park and green space policy advocacy, or on equitable policy advocacy on related issues. So again, that's issues like built environment or climate change, civil rights, community development, environmental justice, and so on. Next, reviewers will be looking for a demonstrated track record of at least 3 years of proactively organizing and advocating for equity-focused policies in the low-income community of color where the proposed initiative will take place. Reviewers will also be looking for extensive experience implementing power building strategies and tactics in your organization's day-to-day work, and looking for evidence of mutual trust with residents, with other community-based organizations and other stakeholders. And reviewers will look for evidence of success with institutionalizing the kinds of supports that enable robust involvement from community residents in policy advocacy work. So that's things like translation and interpretation, childcare, transportation, and compensation. Next, reviewers will look for evidence of skill establishing and maintaining collaborative relationships with elected officials and government agencies to achieve shared policy and systems change goals, and when necessary, holding those decision makers to be accountable. Applicants should also be able to clearly and succinctly describe how existing park and green space inequities affect the community where the proposed policy initiative will take place, and how these park and green space inequities link to other health and social and environmental and economic needs of the community, referencing your ability to work across issue areas. Reviewers will look for evidence of organizational history, working in and with urban, low-income communities of color, and to see that a meaningful portion of the organization's staff and board leadership are representative of the population served. And finally, reviewers will be looking for proven administrative infrastructure and financial management capacity to manage a P3 grant if awarded, and the organizational infrastructure and staffing to conduct policy advocacy work. We would also hope to see, a demonstrated commitment and an articulated willingness to invest organizational resources to continue this work and to continue fundraising for this work and the policy advocacy focus beyond just the P3 grant period. So with all that in mind, here is how to apply for the P3 funding opportunity. All applications must be submitted through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's online system, which you can access at rwjf.org/CFP/P3, and it's shown here on the slides. From there, you'll click on the Apply Online link. And if you have not already done so, you're going to need to register for a new account through My RWJF, which I'll show you in just a moment. So on the next slide, we'll show you what the Call for Proposals webpage looks like and where you can find that Apply Online link. So if you go to rwjf.org/CFP/P3, here's what that page looks like, and you see the Apply Online link there. Clicking on that link will then take you to this page where, again, if you're a new user, you can register for a My RWJF account, or if you've already registered, you can sign in, start your application, save it, and come back to it if needed, and then submit. So as I said just a moment ago, there are 2 stages in the application process: first, letters of intent, and then invited full proposals. We're going to walk through what should be included in each of those stages now. So all applicants will need to submit a letter of intent, or LOI, with a brief narrative. So here are the elements that an LOI should include. First, a project title. Next, a project summary, which is really intended to be brief. I think the system limits you to 1,500 characters, which is about a half page. And then a brief narrative. So this is really the bulk of the LOI, and it is a narrative of no more than 3 pages using 11-point font, single spacing. I think it's Arial. The online system will specify all those formatting requirements, so please follow those. And following the section headings and addressing the items laid out in the call for proposals, which I'll go over next. As with before, we've shortened the descriptions of these on the slides just so that it's easier to read here on the webinar, but please do closely review the call for proposals to make sure you understand what's required. So in your LOI narrative, please describe first your organizational background and experience. Tell us about the lead applicant organization, your leadership, and your connection to people and communities most impacted by park and green space inequities. Tell us about your track record in community organizing and in policy advocacy, and whether you've worked on park equity policy or policy on related issue areas. Please tell us about your strategies and your tactics. And we're especially interested in knowing about the power building strategies and tactics that the lead applicant or coalition uses in your day-to-day work, and the connection between those power building strategies and your policy advocacy work. Next, please describe the need. Tell us about the park and green space inequities in your urban community. Relevant data would be helpful to include, but only if they're available. What's more important is being able to convey a clear sense of your community's park and green space needs and how existing park and green space inequities impact the lives of residents in your community. And finally, we're interested in understanding your vision. Please tell us about how you see addressing the root causes of park and green space inequities in your community. What kinds of policy changes seem relevant in your current context? And if you're already working on local park or green space equity policies, tell us about your goal in addition to the strategies and tactics you're already using. But no matter where you're starting, please tell us, what would progress look like over the next few years if this vision were to be carried forward with P3 funding? In early January 2022, all applicants that submitted a letter of intent will be notified of the status of their LOI. So at that time, a smaller subset of selected applicants will be invited to write and submit a full proposal. I'm not going to spend very long on the full proposal requirements right now, but this is just to sort of give you a sense of what that's going to look like. I will say that a full proposal template and a complete list of required documents to include with an invited full proposal will be provided to those selected applicants in January when notifications are sent out. But just so you're aware now, among the items that we will be requesting as part of those full proposals are a proposal narrative, again, using a template that we will provide in January, a budget and a budget narrative that includes a realistic budget for a 24-month funding period. But again, you don't need to submit a budget during the LOI stage, only with an invited full proposal. Full proposals should also include a few supporting documents, things like CVs, resumes, or bios for key project staff, a project timeline. And then you'll also have the option in the full proposal stage of including up to 3 letters of support from key partners that would collaborate on the proposed initiative. But again, letters of support are not something that we're asking for during the LOI stage. So here is the full application timeline and the key dates to note. So as Manal said, the call for proposals was released on September 15th, and here we are today, September 29th, on the applicant webinar. Letters of intent are due by Thursday, November 4th. Vanessa, if you could go back to the timeline, thanks. Letters of intent are due by Thursday, November 4th, 2021, by 3 p.m. Eastern time. And we really strongly encourage you, please don't wait until the last minute to upload and to submit your proposal in the online system, because the system will shut down when the deadline comes and late submissions will not be accepted under any circumstance. And we would hate for a technical difficulty to be a barrier to you submitting your application. As I said, on January 4th of the new year, all applicants will be notified of the status of their LOI submission, and that's when we will be sending out invitations for selected applicants to submit a full proposal. Those invited full proposals will then be due by February 8th, 2022, again at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then on March 16th, 2022, notification of grant awards will be sent. P3 grants will then begin on May 15th, 2022, again, going for a duration of 24 months or 2 years. So we will begin to wrap up the presentation portion before diving into Q&A by encouraging you once again to carefully review the call for proposals to understand all the submission requirements. Again, we will be taking your questions now, and we will also be accepting questions at p3info@rwjf.org all the way through the letter of intent deadline on November 4th. We will be updating that program-specific frequently asked questions document next week. But even after that document has been updated and posted in the online application system, we'll continue to answer questions by email. So please feel free to reach out if any questions come up. And we will now conclude the presentation portion of today's webinar by, first of all, thanking you for bearing with us with the technical difficulties and saying again how honored Prevention Institute is to be leading and managing this initiative in collaboration with our funding partners, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. We look forward to receiving your LOIs and sharing much more information about the People, Parks, and Power National Initiative in the months ahead. And with that, Manal, I am going to ask you to come back on and serve as our MC. And we're going to stop screen sharing the slides so you'll be able to see everyone's faces as we are taking questions. And thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel, for that. That was a lot of important logistics. And as Rachel said, a lot of this information is available and in greater detail on my RWJF website. We have about 30 minutes left. I'm going to ask Elva to join us. I am going to pick a few questions, as many as we can get through, that are in the Q&A box. And I'll just say there are a number of questions that are very specific to a specific organization or a specific location. And every single question is important to us, but I am going to prioritize for the time that we have questions that I think have more broad applicability and to the larger group. So Elva, I'm going to start with one to you, which came in earlier in the Q&A, which is, would you all consider a Black, Indigenous, people of color led organization that is newly taking on this type of work, but has demonstrated ability in community organizing and civic engagement? Elva, are you with us?
Yes, I'm
Thank you.
here, but I can't unvideo my, open my video. So
okay, your audio sounds great. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think that, we anticipate that we're going to have a range of applicants, and, brand new to policy advocacy can be a challenge for the group. But, it doesn't mean that, they couldn't take on an issue. So on a case-by-case basis, I think we'd have to see the circumstances outlined on that transition that's happening in the organization, who's supporting them, what kind of track record they have all around, are they a respected, well-regarded organization in that community that has the connections, a network connections to decision makers that would, allow it to make that kind of transition. We don't want to say no to anybody, but at the end of the day, this is a competitive process. And, those groups that have that background will probably have an easier time putting together an initiative. So, I don't want to, minimize the importance of having that background to do that work. So that's, I gave it my best shot there. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that, Manal.
Let's hold and keep going. And if we want to add, we can, but thank you all. I thought that was great. A great question from Carl Brown is, would any of these awards consider pools within our parks that have been taken out due to systemic racism? We need our pools so people can get to know each other and create a safer community. Rachel, you want to take that one? And then Elva, you tag team.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So P3 is really intended to support policy advocacy and systems change work. And we certainly understand how structural racism has played out in the siting and in many cases, the closing of public recreation facilities and parks and other green spaces. However, P3 will not fund projects on the ground. So whether that's planning or designing, or conducting community engagement as a part of planning or designing projects, or building, or even operating programs or services within park or recreation facilities. That's not the focus of the P3 initiative. So we understand and greatly appreciate the work you're doing, and also would encourage you to think about those root causes and what some of the policy levers are to address the lack of pools, recreation facilities, and other park spaces in your community, and identify a policy change goal that might solve that problem.
Yeah, so Carl, what I got is that if it's a policy around pools reopening or then yes, if it's a policy or, a change in the park and rec advocating for a change in the park and rec agency practices around that, it would. Elva, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I'll just say, budget advocacy might be the focus of the work here, and understanding, was there a specific policy change, even if it was administrative within the agency to close those pools, looking at that and seeing, what are the levers there. And again, if money needs to be reallocated, those are all relevant policy advocacy objectives that would be could be part of a successful application.
Thanks for the question, Carl. Another one comes in from Anna Jane. I hope I'm saying your name right. Elva, this one's for you. Are we using systems change and policy change interchangeably?
That's a great question. Policy change usually has a very specific meaning of, laws, ordinances, administrative policies, regulations. Systems change can be a little bit more amorphous and could be focused in on, what's happening within an agency, for example, to look at their allocations or the staffing representation of the communities that have the highest needs. I think those are more of the systems change, but we would want to see, even with those, perhaps the creation of a community engagement unit within an agency that doesn't have anything like that now, or a biannual evaluation of spending priorities and how those might be adjusted to address the highest need areas, those areas that have been disinvested for generations, for example. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. I'm going to ask another one here, pose another one. Can municipalities submit to the program as the lead applicant in partnership with one or more local NGOs? And this is coming from Eric, who is Chief of Comprehensive Planning for the City of Annapolis.
So that's a complicated and great question. Conducting policy advocacy for policy change is oftentimes, it has unique players in different roles. So in our experience, in our view, community-based organizations would be advancing, ideas and strategies to decision makers who would then, take those on and hopefully be champions of them. As we've said, no lobbying with these resources. But to have an agency moving forward policy could be difficult for that agency vis-a-vis the decision makers. Most often, agencies don't take on policy change on their own. So that's the realm of decision making. So I think it would have to be very, very carefully thought through. And, the agency would have to really sort of consider how that would play out with their elected officials. But, you know, at any event, the community-based organization would have to be in the lead, and that could, you know, create dynamics later on during the policy advocacy and decision-making process.
I can
Thank
add
you.
to that just that, you know, part of the goal of the P3 initiative is to be resourcing and, you know, building infrastructure among community-based organizations that have historically been excluded from this type of work or have been tokenized in this work. And so, you know, that's part of the rationale of having a nonprofit organization be in the lead, is to lift up their leadership and to build out that organizational infrastructure to be leading this work going forward. So I agree with everything Elva said. And just to clarify the answer to the question is that kind of partnership would be great. And the lead applicant would need to be the nonprofit organization, not the government agency.
Oh, thanks, Rachel and Elva. How about this one from Carol? Are Indigenous peoples included in this strategy?
We are hoping for applications from 501c organizations in urban settings. And we do know that there are many Indigenous groups operating in, you know, urban areas, and we would love to see applications from these groups. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I'm gonna pass this one back to you, Elva. If a park initiative public tax has passed, is implementing components of it possible?
I think that yes, the answer is yes. And, you know, the nuance would be what aspects of oversight and of the implementation would be dealt with. You know, ensuring that policy, equity-focused public finance measure is implemented effectively, and you know, there's oversight for that. Yes.
Thank you. I'm scanning here. Blessings from Borinquen. May you be well and safe today. Muchas gracias. Are U.S. colonial territories and communities in the Caribbean able to receive funds?
Rachel, you want to take that one?
Or maybe we can even have Chris take that one, but go ahead, Rachel, you can start.
Yeah, Chris, I feel free to turn on your video and jump in. So the call for proposals states that applicant organizations that are based in the United States or its territories are eligible to apply. Chris, if there's anything that you would want to add to that or any nuance to provide, please feel free.
No, I agree with exactly what you said, Rachel.
Thank you, Chris. Are there limitations around policy advocacy, legislative advocacy activity, coalitions? Michelle asked, and probably that question came before, Rachel, you described the lobbying limitations. So unless either of you wants to say more on that, I think we might be good, but go ahead, Elva, you have something?
I think, you know, people need to stay on the right side of education versus lobbying. There's so much that you can do before you get to that, you know, fine line. So yeah, I think that's really the bottom line. And keep in mind that we are not asking for a ton of details in the LOI phase. So please, just as a reminder, become very familiar with the call for proposals, what we're asking for, and make sure your answers are geared directly to those questions in this phase of the initiative.
Terrific. And we've already said in the main part of the presentation that while we recognize the importance of statewide policy and federal policy, we see it as a complement, not the focus of P3 funding. However, this next question from Michelle is a bit nuanced, and she asks, or they ask, as a statewide advocacy organization, would we qualify to apply if we identified specific communities that meet the criteria?
So again, going back to the answer that Rachel gave, you know, our intent here in part is to reverse the decades of exclusion of low-income communities of color in the park and green space arena. And our approach to that is to, build up that infrastructure, that social infrastructure, build up the capacity of community-based organizations operating in and with communities of color, so that because their power and their influence tends to be greatest at the local level. So our theory of change is really sort of behind the interest in, advancing local, to build on the strengths and assets of these organizations as a way to expand and transform the field, quite frankly. So while we understand, that, statewide organizations can do a tremendous amount of work, we urge them to partner with these local groups and support in some way as part of their coalition, what have you. But that we really are trying to build the infrastructure and capacity of the organizations operating in and with low-income communities of color in this space.
Rachel, thank you, Alva. Anything you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, this is not exactly what Michelle asked, but I can imagine there are some folks that have this question, and we address this in the program specific FAQ as well. But we have gotten a few questions via email about state level policy or federal level policy advocacy. So I did just want to say, P3 is really focused on local level policy advocacy. And part of that is, following a roadmap that is filled with public health successes and, things like tobacco prevention and control. We really saw that local policy and grassroots level policy advocacy was where a lot of the innovation came. That then fed up to state and eventually national level policy. There's issues of preemption and all that we won't go into now, but a strong local policy and implementation of local policies has been the way that equitable, public health and public policy has happened historically. And also, we recognize that there are state level policies, there are federal policies that contribute to park and green space equity. We generally see those as complements to the P3 initiative, but this initiative is specifically focused on supporting local level policy advocacy.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to acknowledge that we have, I would say I'm going to keep us with Q&A for another 13, 14 minutes and then wrap up. So I'm going to keep us going with this. I think this is very helpful for those who want to stick around and keep listening. And many of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A are also in our FAQ, and whatever we don't get to, we will pour through the questions and make sure to answer as many as we can. There is one question. Thank you, Pamela. I thought that was interesting too, and I was going to get to it next. I'm just scrolling here. Where did it go? Let me see. About anonymous attendee asks, would prison systems be considered part of this funding strategy? For example, prisons generally lack green space. Would an advocacy strategy to increase access to green space in prison qualify for people, parks, and power? Elva, I'm going to kick that question to you.
So I would imagine the jurisdiction for policies governing prison systems are at the state or federal level. You might have a jail, like the county jail. Those tend to be all, one huge, awful building, right? So, technically, it might be a challenge to fit into the local policy. And, we're looking at city policies, county policies, and district policies, local district policies. So, if there was some traction that could be gotten there, but, we hadn't really envisioned something like this, but it is a fascinating question. And thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. Dodie asks, or says that they'd like to explore defining pocket parks. Is it required for this funding opportunity that pocket parks must be publicly available? My org wants to explore micro food forests on private property and public property. My inclination is that a more competitive application would be a publicly available resource. But Elva, what's your thought here?
I mean, if the focus here is on building pocket parks, again, we go back to, we are
Not
not
projects,
funding projects. We're not funding brick and mortar efforts. So if there's a policy that's focusing on pocket parks or neighborhood parks, sure. If it's the actual park, then, you know, we go off into that, the idea that we're veering away from policy advocacy.
I really like Alexander's question, which is that we mentioned that P3 won't fund planning efforts, but what about grassroots policy campaigns that result in community-driven planning and policy documents? And I would say yes to that, but I think there needs to be a policy advocacy direction. Elva, how would you respond to Alexander?
I mean, if here's an example of an advocacy example from real life, where you know, the County of Los Angeles enacted a policy to undertake a comprehensive park needs assessment, park and recreation needs assessment for the entire county. That entailed, given the size of LA County, multiple millions of dollars, because it was 188 community meetings, extensive outreach. So that, you know, that ended up being a document that, you know, continues to serve the issue of park equity as a you know, baseline understanding of what the need is. So I think that would be the type of approach. If there is a policy and resource allocation or reallocation associated with planning, sure. But plans in and of themselves that are not sort of deeply evidence-based, that can sort of be used as a tool for advocates, becomes a little bit more iffy, in my opinion.
Thank you. Jen asks, in the application, do we have to have, have to have a specific policy lever we wish to address identified? Can we put forward a general theme we hope to target? We would like to engage our communities to figure out what they'd like to do to address park inequities.
Yes, we are not asking in the LOI for explicit policy advocacy strategies or objectives. We are asking for some general direction. You know, what's your vision? We ask you what your vision is. And so within that, you know, especially in conjunction with the other questions about your background, your organization's background and history with policy advocacy and making change in your community. Yeah, we don't need explicit details in this round. When we get to the full proposal, you know, if this work is new to a community, but they have a track record of doing, you know, community change to policy advocacy, then yes. I mean, I think it's really sort of like, we anticipate that there is going to be groups that have extensive policy advocacy experience in other issues, climate change, EJ, what have you, who are moving into this new space. We want to see that. We want that to happen because of those decades of exclusion and, you know, tokenized or no funding. So yeah, you know, be very mindful of what we're asking in the call for proposals and respond accordingly.
Thank you. I'm going to take an attempt at answering Dorian's question, but would like backup on it. Dorian asks, do we include sidewalk, trail, and bike lanes, biking and walking infrastructure and related policy systems and environmental change in the definition of parks? And Dorian, where I think we're at right now is, while we recognize that that infrastructure is all critically important physical infrastructure in the ecosystem in terms of access to activity opportunities and alternative transportation, that we are really focused on proximity of parks and green space in low-income African-American, Latino, indigenous communities. And so I think that, again, there would have to be a very compelling case as to why to focus there as critical in terms of the park and open space access issue. In general, less interested in kind of transiting people to parks and outside of their community. So I think that that's how I interpreted that. But we get that that's all part of physical activity infrastructure. Elva, how would you maybe be more precise in an answer to that question?
I think that you did a great job with that. You know, the problem of connectivity is real, but you know, what is the primary challenge that your community is facing really should be sort of what you're looking at and responding accordingly. But I think your answer was great.
I think we're going to have, thanks, Elva. We're going to have time for maybe a couple more questions. And one, I think, is from Julia that I really appreciate, which they asked, would you fund organizations to do their own documentation of needs and inequities, or would this need to be advocating for public agencies to undertake that work?
Absolutely. I mean, we believe in participatory research, and we hope through our technical assistance program to facilitate that approach. We hope to have resources to help undertake that kind of research. You know, we do not think it should only be government agencies that do that work. It's great if they do it, because that sort of indicates a direction that they're moving into the equitable park and green space, you know, realm. But absolutely, community-based organizations should and have a strong history of participatory research.
Gianni asks, could community climate resilience plans with a special focus on green space accessibility be considered for grant approval? Gianna, we thought a lot about this, and we actually answered a very similar question in the FAQ. And I think really the answer, ultimately the short answer is no, because plans are typically sort of, you know, non-binding or policy change documents. We don't think they are the focus for this. Rachel, you helped talk through that. Do you want to answer any more about that?
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, the concern with a plan is that the implementation of a plan is completely dependent on who is in charge of a public agency, who's working within the public agency, you know, the elected official, and that often plans are not binding. So the advantage of a policy is that a policy has to be implemented, you know, whether it's implemented with fidelity to the equity priorities, that's another matter. And, you know, that's something we're open to funding through P3, is the equitable implementation of policies that have passed. But as critical as climate resilience is, and as related as climate resilience, climate adaptation are to parks and green space, you know, we absolutely recognize the intersection, and we encourage folks to focus on that intersection, especially in frontline communities. A plan as the outcome of a P3 effort is not what we're looking for, again, because it's not binding in the same way that an ordinance or a policy is.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap us up in just 1 minute, but there's one question that I think encapsulates an interest a bunch of folks are kind of interested in. It comes from anonymous attendee number 2. If you do not have 3 years of track record of organizing and advocating for equity-focused policy and agency policy, should you not submit applications? Elva, why don't you take that one?
So, you know, this is sort of a variation on what I said before, but, you know, if you have 2 years and you have great, you know, allies who have tons of years of experience, who are part of your coalition, we're not going to, not look at the LOI. But what we want to see is a definite understanding of what policy and systems change is, and clear infrastructure or grounding that will move in that direction. This is where it gets, grant making can be challenging, and there's
Nuance.
Yeah, there's nuance, and sometimes it's a case-by-case basis, but in general, we want to make sure that those who are applying are committed to policy advocacy change. They have the resources within their organization and or coalition to have that focus and have it be manifested in a way that will move the needle. We want to move the needle in this direction. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. And, want to first of all, just both thank Elva and Rachel for joining me in the Q&A. It is not easy to sort of answer these live, and they're all great questions. So we thank everyone for taking the time to be with us and the bravery to pose your question. And if you didn't pose your question or get it answered today directly, we really encourage you to email p3info@rwjf.org. We are working to respond to those questions. And before you pose the question, though, of course, we encourage you to review thoroughly all the materials we provided, which we hope explain, the gist and the specificity of what we're looking for this initiative. As a reminder, letters of intent are due by November 4th, 3 p.m. Eastern time. And we want to say that this is one piece of a broad movement that is burgeoning for park and green space equity across the country. And so we thank you for the many, many ways that you are already advancing park equity, health equity, and racial justice. And we look forward to continuing the work ahead together. I want to close by thanking all of you, wishing you a wonderful rest of your day, and thanking all of us here who did the hard work of putting this webinar together. Goodbye. And we look forward to hearing more from you. Take care, everybody.